Welcome to another episode of the Applied AI podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Andra. We have with us on today's episode, Bharathi Rajan. Bharathi, welcome.
Hi, Jacob. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So you are with Swire Coca-Cola. Tell us a little about the company and your role in.
Okay, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Bharathi Rajan. I lead enterprise digital data and AI here at Swire Coca-Cola USA. Been with Swire for just over 4.5 years now. I came in with the intent of standing up the data team, really, right? Focusing on what do we think, how do we bring all of the data together, what's that strategy and everything. And then over time, now I have a digital and AI responsibility. I've taken on that responsibility as well. My experience really has been in data and analytics for a long time. I started my career as a software engineer, but that lasted less than a year. And then I moved into the data space really. And then over time, I've worked in different industries. So before joining Swire, I was with UnitedHealth Group, where I was leading data engineering and software engineering teams. And then prior to that, I was with Goldman Sachs, where I stood up the BI capabilities in operations and then moved over to the controllers finance division to stand up product management and governance. So, and then prior to that, again, healthcare, medical device, retail. So I've been in various industries. And so coming into Swire, this is my first manufacturing industry. So a lot of opportunity to learn about manufacturing, understand how manufacturing really happens, and then see how I can apply my experience and work through the challenges that we see here.
How would you categorize it?
Good question. So Swire is one of the top 5 bottlers in the country. So we manufacture, distribute as well for mostly in the American West. So we have 13 states where we distribute, and then we have 6 manufacturing plants in those 13 states where we manufacture our products. We're brand partners with Coca-Cola, obviously, but we're also brand partners with BodyArmor, Monster Energy, and with Dr. Pepper.
Great. So a fairly large operation, obviously, and a lot to manage there.
Yes.
Massive amount of data being collected. And as we know, data is a core part of any AI strategy, especially if you're talking on the organizational level. You and I were chatting just a little before I started the podcast recording on how adopting AI as an individual is fairly simple. You just get a subscription and you start using it in your day to day. But on an organizational level, there's a lot of orchestration and integration and architecture that needs to happen to make it all function the way it needs to. I'd love to hear your take on some of that and what your experience has been.
Yeah, absolutely. As I took on this relatively new capability to lead the company, it was, as I've been using AI in my personal life and my kids are using it, everyone across, right? We teach our parents how to use AI. And it's great because it's so much more faster and easier to do things. And it comes naturally to us when we're using it in our personal lives. But when how you take that and you translate that at the enterprise level is a completely different ballgame because there are so many, to your point about there's so many processes, there are so many, data sources that you have to think through. There's so many existing things that you don't consider applications, software, hardware, all of that. How do you bring it all together? And I think the biggest challenge, and I don't mean this as a challenge, and how do you think about change management, right? Because change management is a critical component of how what we do at an enterprise level. And if we can't think about end-to-end change management and how does that really impact people, process, and technology. We're using existing technology. What do we do with that existing technology? How do we train our people? What's that adoption going to be? A lot of times people are scared of, hey, you know what, AI is going to take my job. So how do you think about change management? Because it's not necessarily that I'm going to take someone's job away, but I'm going to be able to take what they're doing that may not be as much value add to having them do something else that's more value add. So how do you change that thought process? There's just so many components, and so it becomes so much more harder. It's one person in your personal life that you're trying to change, and you're trying to use the AI tools, whereas versus in an organization, there are hundreds and thousands of people. And how do you think about change management?
Absolutely. In the end, if people aren't going to use the capabilities you provide, they're not going to be worth very much to the organization. So that needs to be sort of fundamentally integrated from the start. The change management component, the human. Not every AI solution has to be a new surface for people to learn. Some of them can be woven into the background. There are very good examples, we've architected where the actual AI capability is very much backgrounded and there isn't a ton of change management required because you're working with how people already work. The AI is operating in the background. Depending on the application, that's possible more in some cases, less in others. There may be specific individuals who need to change their habits more than others, and so on and so forth. And that all needs to be carefully thought through as you're creating your AI strategy. But yeah, to the degree you're able, and I don't know how much you're able to share, I would love to hear specific work you've done in Swire, specific initiatives you've implemented, or even ones that are sort of on the table or being planned out. How are you thinking about AI in Swire, and what are the main surface areas you're looking at?
So we're looking at it across the enterprise, right? So starting with IT, there's so many use cases in IT that we're looking at and we're saying, hey, how can we automate this, right? Can we automate it? What are the components that we can automate? What makes sense? So from an ROI perspective, does it make sense for us to automate? And what does that mean from an overall process standpoint? So lots of use cases within IT, especially in our data governance, master data space, right? I'm a huge believer and I'm a proponent of governance. And so can we automate governance and what does that really look like? Right? Where are, today we have checklists and things like that. Can we automate that process to a point where then we just have one place where we need human in the loop? What does that look like? Right? So thinking about the process end to end. So even before we dive into looking at automation or, looking at use cases, how do we then look at the process, understanding what that current process looks like? If I don't have a clear visibility into the current process, I can't automate the process. So IT is a big area for us, but also from an enterprise standpoint, we're looking at supply chain. We're looking at sales. What does that look like? A lot of times when our sales associates go into meeting their customers or they're going to deliver, right? They have a lot of applications sometimes they have to open up. Can we consolidate and can we look at, hey, how do we make their lives easier, right? At the end of the day, it's the business impact that I'm looking at. Can I bring in business impact? Because just by putting a technology doesn't necessarily mean it's going to improve someone's ways of working. So how do you keep that business impact really in the forefront when you're automating it? And then in terms, and we were looking at one use case in the supply chain point of view. How do you prioritize what to manufacture, right? So if you think about, we call it prioritization, but really from how do I prioritize which products to produce? Because that's going to have the highest impact. And this is what the customers, my end customers are looking for. It's, at the customer level, at the production level, really, which ones do I produce? Because I only have limited capacity in my lines really to produce. And then from a warehouse, how do I prioritize which products need to go out? So that's one use case where we've really automated that, or are at least in the process of automating it. And that, I think is going to is going to be significantly good for the teams that are going to be using it, just because it's decisions that they can really rely on without having to input a bunch of numbers. They have all of that information at their fingertips.
Yeah, that's great. For the sales team, what are you thinking there? Like, what are you looking at to improve? Because that's a great one to look at. If you can improve the rate at which the sales team can do their prospecting and improve the close rate and the quality of outreach, that goes straight to top line revenue. And so that's a clear win. And lots of companies are very interested in that. I'm curious how you're looking at improving that process and where you're looking to bring AI into it.
We haven't really dived into a lot of these sales processes, really, honestly, right? Yes, there are lots of opportunities, but we really, I mean, that's again, as I've taken on this role, it's how do I prioritize which areas to look at, right? Whether that's operational efficiency, are we looking at, top line growth, right? both are important, but which one is a priority? And those are things that we still haven't made a full-fledged decision because, I can think about Q1, I can focus on operational efficiencies. Maybe Q3 and Q4, I need to start focusing on sales. And how do I change that? To your point about prospecting, can I make it much more easier for them? Those are things that and we don't want to go into this by ourselves. We want our sales teams to be part of this planning process because they are the boots on the ground and they understand the business really well. So I want them to come back and say, hey, here are the 4 areas that we want you to focus on versus me telling them what to focus on. So, but to answer your question, really, we haven't dived into one specific area in sales right now because we've focused on a couple of other areas so far.
Yeah, yeah. And when you do, I mean, there are opportunities for custom harnesses. Are you familiar with this term like harness engineering to put a harness around a large language model? So we do a lot of that. You can put the right context and logic around a large language model and the right
Hmm.
workflows and your sales logic. And
Yep.
that can be a fairly low cost, low lift way to rapidly improve sales performance. So that will be a good one to look at when you're ready. And you're right,
Yep.
it's always a trade-off.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's always a trade-off whether you want to look at, operational efficiency, rapid increase in top line revenue, increasing new capabilities, increasing rolling out new capabilities, leveraging your data assets, so many different angles to look at and it's hard to rank them, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and how do you rank them, right? So one of the other things that we're trying to think through is what is that capable, what's the criteria, right? In addition to, yes, it's going to increase operational efficiency, but that if it's going to take me a year to get to that optimal operational efficiency, is it worth me going down that path, right? Or do I have these short-term goals or short-term goals, but also short-term advantages where I can say, hey, if I look at sales, this is going to get me a top line revenue growth in the next 5 to 6 months. So do I go in and invest in that, or do I look at long-term operational efficiencies? Those are things that, again, we're internally trying to prioritize what that means and how do we go around and go about doing it. Even skill set developed, right? Over time, how are we thinking about people's skill set development? Are we thinking about building internally tools and applications, or do we want to build external tools and application? What does that, or buy from externally, right? So what does that really look like? Yeah, so there's a lot of prioritization work that we're trying to do now that we've had some success in the first 2 quarters of how we want to build the agents and what we are looking at now. Our focus is more on, hey, we have a lot of use cases, but before we dive into any of these use cases and start building them, we also want to understand what does organizational change look like? How do we make sure that everyone comes along in this journey and it's not just a few people that are going to come along? So thinking about organizational change management is where I'm focusing on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about prioritization, the larger the organization, the more important it is to thoughtfully think about that prioritization. And that's a significant part of the early work we typically do with clients is just sorting through all the opportunities because there's no shortage of opportunities where you could invest in improvements and prioritizing them. And usually the optimal tends to come out to be some mix of the long-term sequencing sprinkled with short-term wins, but all of them kind of built to be or calibrated to be compounding on each other. The old model of the I'll talk about like this old paradigm that I feel like is fast getting outdated, where for every capability you want to bring in, there's a corresponding software subscription. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. There's a surface, a dashboard, a login for a capability. And of course, AI is rendering that model obsolete. And you can now start getting many economies of scale, or to use the old adage, multiple birds with one stone, and start choreographing this stuff to be compounding on itself, where as you're investing in one capability, it's actually sequencing some future capabilities that are going to leverage off it. And so that prioritization work is so important.
That is, and you hit the nail on the head, Jacob, because it's not just sequencing it, but it's also, hey, if I'm bringing this X capability in, can I leverage that in other areas, right? And that's how organizations should be thinking, because at the end of the day, if you're going to be talking about one capability, it's not just one capability, to your point. Hey, it's sequencing. Hey, what are the other capabilities should I be thinking about in other areas? What's the downstream impact? Is there an upstream impact? How are we thinking? And then thinking about it from a, hey, end to end, can this talk to this new capability that I'm thinking about? What is it going to drive? How is it, hey, if this is going to drive, this X capability is going to drive operational efficiency, is this going to impact the top line revenue growth? How is this all linked together? Those are things that most organizations are, I think they're starting to think through it, but I haven't heard a lot of people really diving into and looking at it holistically.
Exactly. And, this old model, this one-to-one model, what you end up with if you go down that path is you end up with a lot of islands of efficiency where AI is embedded in these kind of walled garden software ecosystems. So it's great that you can query with AI within some specific ecosystem. Let's just say it's for your governance or it's for your accounting or whatever, but none of them are really talking to each other and there's no overarching strategy. And when you start moving beyond that paradigm, it doesn't mean you're not going to have any software subscriptions, but you start architecting it more holistically. Maybe you're building some of your internal harnessing that starts pulling from multiple systems and starts creating these compounding capabilities. For example, if you build a custom harness for your internal sales logic, that can inform all kinds of future capabilities as well that you can bootstrap and leverage off that. So it's an exciting time, and the paradigm is shifting rapidly. But you're right, not a lot of people are caught on to that the game has already shifted. Many organizations are still stuck in that old paradigm.
They are, and it's hard to get out of it, right? I mean, think about it. You have your Salesforce subscriptions, you have, your ERP, your, SAP. Everyone is building their own AI models, their own agents. How do you think, to your point about how do you bring it all together, I think is where the organization wins, because it can all be siloed. SAP can be siloed because they have their own agents, but how do you connect SAP to Salesforce? How do these agents talk, that orchestration, that sequencing, all of that comes into play? And back to the original questions, this is why it becomes so much more harder at the organization level, because you have to think about it and you have to architect the entire thing in such a way that it's seamless to the front end. The users who are using this, the tool, it should be seamless to them. They should not be worrying about, hey, do I go to Salesforce? Do I go to SAP? How do you make it so easy for them to use that they are, they're going to naturally adopt it?
Exactly. And, that can be done. And to your point about the difficulty, I don't want to let the emphasis on the difficulty eclipse the benefits that are to be had. When you start creating these orchestrated capabilities, the benefits can be absolutely massive, but they're not easy. It's not as easy as
They're not easy.
they're
Yeah.
not easy, but the payoff is huge because you're literally steering the entire organization.
It is. I mean, the payout is going to be huge if we architect it the right way and we understand what that end to end is going to look like. It's going to change how we do things, right? And it's going to be beneficial to the end users more than anything else. The back end, how we do it and what's being done. That's where the crux of it is, right? There's where the most of the work is. When it comes to the user, they're going to look at one thing and they're going to say, I'm just going to go to this thing and this thing is going to give me the answer. And that's going to be, it's going to be perfect. I mean, to me, that's the perfect world. And that's where at the end, add one more thing. As a personal user, I don't know which LLMs are being used when I go to ChatGPT or Claude, wherever I go, right? What happens in the back end is not where, and this is why it makes it so much more easier for us on the personal level, because we don't know what's going on in the back. But if we can get that same experience at the organizational level, that's where you'll find success.
Absolutely. I totally agree. You talked earlier about automation. One message I've been sounding to our clients is that there's automation and then there's augmentation. And a lot of what we're talking about with organizational change and AI integration is augmenting people's roles, not completely automating them. There are certain things, and it's more few and far between. It's more rare that you can completely automate a role or a task. But augmentation, I think, is where the lion's share of the gains are to be had. What do you think?
I completely agree. People, you can't take people away from a process, right? And so how do you augment or add AI into a process that'll enable and, augment people doing what they're supposed to be doing versus I think, I use this term value add. There's so much more value that a individual brings into a process that you can't see AI bringing that in right now. And so you do absolutely need, you're augmenting a process using technology to get a better outcome for the people and for the enterprise.
Absolutely. And even augmentation doesn't totally capture it because in many cases you can now add to the process, you can add new capabilities or new ways the process can be done that weren't possible before. So it's not just making an old process better, but it's fundamentally in many cases reshaping the way the work is done, but still keeping a human involved.
Hmm. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Can you speak to some of the supply chain work that you're looking at with AI and how you're thinking about integrating AI into the supply chain side? Because that's a big topic for a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, I think I mentioned one of the use cases. So how do you prioritize production of, products? And then, how do you prioritize which customers they go to if you have limited? And then, in terms of how do I prioritize shipping those products out, right? So that's one area. I think there's so many areas that you can think of. Hey, if I want to if I have, we think about planning, right? You have a short-term window, you have a long-term window. How do you think about planning? If I have a short-term request that's coming in, how do I think of planning for that short-term request? We have a process in place, but can I use AI to supplement that and to provide more information for the person who's planning it and also the person who's making the decision? How can I use AI to augment that and make that decision faster, really? So that's another area that we're looking at, short-term versus long-term planning. And then, overall process, right? So predictive maintenance is a big thing. How do I, from a manufacturing point of view, how do I think about predictive maintenance? Do I, can I, figure out predictive maintenance using AI? What does that look like? What kind of data do I need? Do I have all of that data? How do I use that to change or not change, but necessarily, but also think in terms of downtime, right? So in manufacturing, downtime is a big deal. If I have unplanned downtime, it stops me from producing. So can I use predictive maintenance to lower my unplanned downtime, and what would that look like? Because again, there's a lot of planning and thinking that needs to happen before, because the data exists. A lot of this data really exists today. How do you bring that in and incorporate that into an existing process in general, right? Implementation.
A very smart approach. You want to definitely be careful and cautious and test things and prove them out. But to your point about the complexity, when you're talking about supply chain management and reducing downtime and better prediction, that's very complex. There are so many different surface areas to this whole chain of causality. And you're going to be talking about a very orchestrated ensemble of solutions across those. You will have, of course, the data part is huge, and having your data clean and ready. The right types of AI for different parts of the process. You'll want some large language models for certain portions, some predictive algorithms or, machine learning components for different ones. I know that you probably know Dr. Alexandra Passi. She's also on the Women's Tech Council with you, and her Luma Warp model is very good at that kind of tabular data, massive data set predictive capabilities. And so it all has to be carefully architected out because you're going to have multiple capabilities playing off each other and collaborating because the surface area of supply chain optimization is so heterogeneous and diverse, and massive.
Yes.
It's a massive surface area.
Yeah. I think just thinking to your point, it's complex, right? You have so many different things you have to think about. And so orchestration, architecting it, orchestrating it, bringing it all together again, to make this process seamless to someone who's going to be using it is the most important thing. And if I get even 1% of that wrong, then I lose the person's trust, right? And in all of this, it's if people do not trust the solution that they're using, we're going backwards then. So yes, it is I really cannot downplay how important it is to think through the process, the existing process well. And there are certain things that we can miss. And so just thinking about it from a holistic point of view and then going down that path and then tweaking it as you move forward. I can't say enough about it.
Absolutely. And you're going to have your early adopters, internal champions, and you can use those for your early proof of concepts, because they understand that it's going to be buggy and we're working the solution out. And so if you have them on board, you get a lot more bandwidth for failure. But as you roll it out to the organization as a whole, to the maybe average person who just wants it to work, that's when you have to be a lot more careful. So you can also do it in stages.
Hmm? And we are, right? But even the first initial adopters, right? They're also new to this. So, yes, it can be buggy, but at the same time, I need it to be in a certain stage that they feel comfortable using it. And so, training and, hey, here are things. Yes, if it's not working, let's look into what's going on. So, there's a lot of, I don't like to use the word hand holding, but it's change management. And how do you help people cross that line into being comfortable using something like, AI in their jobs, really.
So true. It all comes down to proper planning and architecture in advance and orchestration. Well, thanks for coming on. This has been a fascinating conversation. I love your perspective.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me.